Hey everyone, welcome to Cube Reviews episode 32. This is your host, Ian Braverman. I hope you're having a really nice day. Today I am joined by Joe Vandenberg. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm doing well. I had a lot of fun meeting you at Boston Cube Party. What was that, a month ago at this point? And
Yeah, it
unfortunately, I
feels
didn't
like
have
it.
a chance to play the cube that we're going to be talking about today, but I was very excited hearing about it.
Yeah, of course. It was kind of a chance encounter that your friend brought it to your attention and we got to meet. So that was pretty cool. I think that what's always made Cube events fun is the opportunity to meet new people. And you never know what it comes from those opportunities.
I totally agree. Yeah, when Kyle introduced us,
Mhm.
it was, I think, after like the fourth draft already. And I was like, shoot, I don't have a chance to play this cube now, but I definitely
Yeah.
want to play it, even if you are in California.
Yeah. I felt that way too when you're on Heater Network and you're assigning ranks to your cubes. I think I edited mine at least like 12 times because there were so many things that I wanted to try. And it's fun because the more you talk to people, the more you get a desire to play certain cubes. And then it just like increases your like, oh my God, I got to try all of these things. And then eventually you just don't, there's just not enough time to play everything. But that's what keeps you coming back, you know, is there's always going to be more cubes and always going to be more opportunities, which is really fun.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I love going to these cube events. I feel very happy that there are so many cube events on the East Coast, and I definitely plan on going to more. And are you going to be going to Cali Cube Championship?
Yeah, I'm gonna try to be. My future is a little up in the air right now because I've been applying for jobs kind of all over. And so I'm in like second stage interviews with people at different places. And you know, one of those is in Boston. So I might be on the East Coast and then flying back out to the West Coast for California Cube Champs rather than being out here and being able to go to that. So I have no idea what the future holds. We'll find out. We'll find out.
Yeah, that's very exciting. And if you are here on the East Coast, we'd love to have you for some cube here. I say it every week, but we cube every week at Games IRL in Avon, Connecticut. If you happen to be in the area, we're always looking for more cubers.
Sure.
And Joe, introduce yourself. What's your history with cube and magic?
Yeah, of course. So I I got started on Magic in middle school. Shout out to the middle school library where my buddy and I, who's like my good friend at the time, everyone carries that one day one from middle school. And we walked by the table and we saw a bunch of people playing games. And our initial confrontation with this group, we were like, hey, what's going on here? We were generally confused. I think because at the time there had recently been a school policy that they had like banned trading cards, but
Oh,
they'd found refuge in the library. So we were confused at like what this was and how that the school had allowed it. And they were like, "Well, you want to join the group?" And we're like, "I have no idea what this is, but I mean, if you want to show us, we're down." So my buddy and I started playing Magic in middle school. We had, looking back on it, none of the rules were right. Notoriously, once we started to get towards like eighth grade, then we started getting more of the rules correctly. But we were playing just like, we'll call it a more evocative but less rules followed version of Magic. And then I stopped playing a little bit in high school because people aren't very nice to you. So then I picked it up again in college when I kind of discovered more of myself. And I've been playing Magic like off and on since then for 7 or 8 years. And it wasn't until COVID where I ironically decided to build my first cube because everyone was indoors and I needed I just wanted like another project to work on. Fortunately, one of the things I did do during COVID was build a cube. The other projects I tried, like buying a harmonica to teach myself harmonica, those did not come to fruition. I did manage to build a cube though. Coming out of COVID, I was able to play with a few people. It was pretty rough in terms of like what I would consider a well-designed cube now. But for a first-time design cube, without having access to any real cube design resources, I did okay. It was really fun for people who had played it for the first time. And I think what helped was that I've played a lot of board games. And so I was already pretty accomplished. I'd already designed a couple prototypes for certain things. So even doing things like keeping in mind player experience was helpful in terms of how I designed my first cube. It was a cube based around what I thought were the most beloved limited archetypes. And so these were things like Flashback and Madness. In some ways was like a Horizon set that I had personally designed. And it's been really fun. I still have it to this day, much more modified version now, but it's really fun. And I kind of look back on it as a kind of design look like for my first cube. Last year, I'd only been able to play this like 4 or 5 times, but it was just a fun thing for me to have and just tinker around with every now and then. But last year, then I discovered the San Francisco Cube Group and hung out with them a couple times, and that's how I learned about Cali Cube Champs. After Cali Cube Champs, the dam kind of broke. And I got really deep into it. And then here we are now.
That's really cool to hear that you basically started with board games and having actually designed a couple board games and then went on to build cubes after that. I feel like that's kind of the opposite of what I've heard from other people that in some ways building a cube is kind of like building a board game with training wheels.
Mhm.
And then after that, people build a board game or come up with their own game after that. So that's really cool to hear that you had this experience with actual game design before coming up with cubes on your own.
Yeah, I during COVID, I had met a couple people who had started to dive deeper into the board game scene. And so that was just a leap that we all made together. And we hosted just like in your COVID bubble, as you will, impromptu board game tournaments. And we would design games and bring them to each other's house and show them that way. So that was where I cut my teeth on a lot of this. And it's changed now. I think there's some interesting differentiation you can make between cube design and board game design, which I think are really interesting and that I've had to learn coming from the other way. Because at the time, even when I was designing my own cube, I really wasn't that into Magic. I just did it as a way to engage with game design and hang with some of my Magic friends. Not that because I was into Magic as much at the time. It was just kind of the overlap between those two hobbies.
Yeah. And what are some of your hobbies outside of Magic then?
I play a lot of soccer and I consume a lot of sports content. I'm a historian by trade. I'm an architectural historian, so I study a lot of architecture, a lot of history, a lot of sports. I do a lot of just independent reading, game design. So yeah, that's generally my hobbies outside of Magic. A lot of history, a lot of sports, and a lot of board games.
That's sweet. I was actually just watching a little bit of Jeopardy before we started recording. I'm terrible
Oh,
at Jeopardy,
nice.
though. My goal is to get like 1 to 2 answers right every time I watch it.
Hey, that's a good bar to start at.
I got Veggie Tales right today. That was one of the
Oh,
answers.
that's the OG, man. Some of the VeggieTales memes hit so hard too. I think they're so funny.
Yes. So, yeah, that's really cool that you have those great hobbies outside of Magic. And I'm excited to talk today about the Brooding Saga Cube.
Yes.
What does it mean for a saga to be brooding?
It was a name I kind of picked on a whim because I wanted something that would be recognizable and like kind of chic where you would like hear the name and get the premise of the cube, but also have it be kind of like give an overview of like what I think a story can be. Because really a saga is just another name for it's just like an epic story. And usually when you hear the term saga using the English language, it's beside the word brooding. It was a phrase I thought people would recognize, and it has a magic connotation, so it made sense to call the cube that. I've been kind of tinkering with changing the name. We'll see if I ever get to that. But yeah, the cube is all about sagas, basically. I had been inspired by the Ristic Studies video on sagas. I had always been drawn to them, even before the Ristic Studies video came out. In my own limited archetypes cube, I had put a lot of sagas in there, like Bertha Miletus in there and other stuff for just they synergize with like all these different things because they have so many varied effects. I love how they force players to think ahead and plan ahead around different chapters. It involves one of my favorite skills that I really enjoy about board games, which is sequencing. And Magic already lends itself well to this, especially with its mana system, how it grows over time, and how it asks you to sequence not only your turns, but your individual actions and even how you resolve cards sometimes. And Magic players have gotten really good at shorthanding a lot of those sequencing tools. Sagas throw even another little wrench in there. So these already sequence aligned brains are being asked to solve this other challenge that's being thrown into the mix. And that's what I really liked about it. My first version of the cube had a lot of suspend stuff too, because I really like suspend as a mechanic for how it forces players to plan ahead for future turns. Having suspend and sagas in the same cube proved to be a little too much it was a little too much. So then I narrowed it down. And then it was a story version of the cube, and it was based around sagas and adventures, which was very thematic, very flavorful. Unfortunately, everyone just picked all of the adventures and none of the sagas in, functional cube draft, which is not something my game design brain had quite put together would happen. But the moment I saw it happen, I was like, oh, that's a problem. Nobody's going to first pick a saga over like a Bone Crusher giant. So that needed to change. And then I ended up on kind of a more current iteration of the cube of just sagas, and I really liked how it's played out. So I really dove down that. And the name was just kind of a way to reflect that there are these delayed effects coming turn after turn after turn. So brooding is something that's supposed to be impending, and saga is obviously the story. So I think that the way that the name fits the actual mechanic of what a saga is doing in the game of Magic fits really well.
I love sagas. Planeswalkers are a good mechanic and a good card type because they give you choice each turn.
Hmm.
But I feel like sagas are almost planeswalkers done better in a lot of ways.
Yes. You're
Planeswalkers just
not the
kind of
only one to
become
have that
very
opinion.
repetitive. Like you do the plus, you do the plus, you do the minus. And compared to a saga where you can really see, like you said, in a story, what's going to happen step by step. I just really like how sagas play out a lot better, honestly. I think, like you said, they film so much more flavorful. They add this great planning ahead to the game compared to a planeswalker where it's just, I'm going to plus, and if you can't kill it, eventually I'll.
Yeah. I think that's a design issue that a lot of the original Planeswalkers had, where they had three abilities, but functionally they only had one or two because the ultimates just are never really practical to reach. I like that they've started to expand their design on Planeswalkers to consider that a Planeswalker does not have to be this strict template of abilities from a plus, a minus, and an ultimate, and that they can have all these different range of effects. What I think is made Saga such a hit off the bat is they already had decades of design of planeswalkers, right? The first planeswalkers came out in 2007 with Lorwyn. And by the time Sagas came out in 2015, 2016, I think, with Dominaria, they had 10 years to figure out how to do these effects right. And what I like about a saga is they're templated in a similar way, especially the Dominaria sagas, right? They have the three abilities. The initial, we'll call it a plus ability. There's the middle one called the minus ability. And then the last one is like, kind of like the ultimate. And I really like how I felt like this is like their third crack at it, and they really nailed the implementation this time. It's also not surprising to me that Richard Garfield designed sagas to play like mini board games. Initially, sagas had chapters you would unlock by doing something. So if you are familiar with the original design of sagas, there would be sagas like chapter one would be like you have three creatures in play, and then you unlock the second chapter of the story, and then you do the third one. And then they realized that that was if you have multiple play, it gets a little too complex with competing goals and narratives, and where each individual saga can feel like a mini game. If you have multiple of them out, they will pull you in too many different directions. And thematically, as a story, when you read it, how they've designed them to be real world examples of things people would produce about their past, they are something you experience in a linear fashion. So the fact that you will resolve them at very specific times, step by step by step, almost as if you were reading them, I think the gameplay resonance of that there is super strong. And part of the reason that I really like sagas from that aspect. And so the fact that they've had 10 years to design them by the point in 2015 or 2016 where they hit Dominaria and they're able to design sagas in this way, I think made the first batch hit super well, and they've been beloved ever since. And the cube I tried to just build is kind of like a testament to the card type.
Absolutely. And getting into the design of this cube, I think it's a really cool combination, almost like two cubes that I own in some way.
Mhm.
My proliferate cube, which is all about different counters and manipulating counter types. And also my trinket cube, which is my lower power artifact cube that's built all around cheap artifacts that don't really do a lot on their own. But if you're able to combine them or do interesting synergies with them, then these little trinket artifacts can become really powerful. Like with sagas, it's all about manipulating the saga counters, removing counters, proliferating counters. And then also you get the additional synergy with sagas, like in my synergy cube, with sacrificing enchantments, using them for additional value and using them in really interesting ways. Tell me about the process of towing the line for this cube between it being like a saga cube and a more general enchantment focused cube. Like that's something that I've faced
Yeah.
with my trinket cube between, oh, this is a trinket cube that's all about the cheap artifacts and just a more generic artifact cube.
Yeah, it's tough. Fortunately, I think what helped is my first design iteration. I just included like all of the sagas that I found cool and fun, and that included the Universe Beyond sagas. The only enchantments in the cube were sagas, basically. So it's a line that I wasn't even close to approaching when I first started to build the cube. And then when I started to incorporate some more and more enchantment synergies going along, and this definitely occurred after a conversation with my friend Jesse, who goes by Jesse Bear on Discord, who kind of helped me figure out that like, hey, some of this broader enchantment synergy stuff can be really interesting in your cube. It just can't invalidate the other saga synergy, which is actually the reason I don't have any of the enchantresses in the cube. Because what I found was when I put the enchantresses in the cube, one thing people would do is they would take the enchantresses and then they would take every enchantment they saw. And because those enchantresses can invalidate some of the inherent card advantage that sagas give you. So people were like, I want to see an enchantress deck here. The problem is if you put an enchantress in the sagas cube, which already has 130 enchantments in it, every deck becomes an enchantress deck. Every gameplay plays out the same way. And I didn't like that gameplay experience. So it's a line that I've run up to a couple times. So that's why you won't see enchantresses in this cube like you might in a lot of other like enchantment-based cubes. I struggled with some of the Duskmourn cards because they're so enchantment heavy, like Entity Tracker. You know, whenever an enchantment enters the battlefield, you draw a card. Like, yeah, that card would be great in this cube, but there's a reason I'm not putting it in. It's because that's not the type of gameplay that I really want to encourage. I want you to more be focused on the sequencing of sagas and how to get the most use out of the chapter abilities, rather than can you just spam as many sagas as you want in your deck. There are a couple decks in the cube that want to do that, but I don't want every deck to be like that. I like that there's a range of decks. Some will want 10, 11 sagas, and some will want 4 to 5. I like that there's that kind of range, and it depends on what your deck is doing and how you're trying to abuse it.
That's a really interesting point about that. I've actually experienced similar things in some of my cube design. For example, I'll build a thematic cube or a themed cube around a specific thing. Like, for example, my proliferate cube being all about counters. And I'll be really excited to put a card that works extremely well with counters into it and be like, oh, this is the perfect environment for this cube. Like, for example, the card All Will Be One, which is
Yeah.
3 red for an enchantment. Whenever a counter is put on one of your permanents, you deal damage equal to the number of counters to any target. And that card, I was like, wow, I was so excited to put this in the cube. It was like a big reason I built the cube. But it turns out when you're putting counters on everything, that card actually just becomes turbocharged and way too powerful for the cube I originally designed it to be in. And it sounds like that's a similar experience to what you're having with these enchantresses, where it's like these enchantresses seem like a no-brainer. It's a cube with a ton of enchantments in it,
Yeah,
but
almost
it turns out they're
130.
too good.
Yep. Part of the issue, right, from like a logistical standpoint on how to resolve some of this problem is you analyze the gameplay pattern that these cards create. And then you ask yourself critically, is this an experience that I want players to have in the cube? For a lot of cases, a lot of the general enchantment based stuff, the answer was no. That's not a gameplay pattern that I want players to experience. Also because that's something that they can get in other enchantment based cubes. The cube will feel more unique, more special, more true to its goals if I only include things that are going to be specifically or uniquely good with sagas. And even then, I still run into some problems. So I think that that's a good way that I've attempted to try and resolve it. I was asking myself critically what gameplay experience I want the cards in the cube to give. We're going to talk about it later too, about some of the cards and the different gameplay experiences that they've created and how that informs my future design decisions going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Like this cube, like my trinket cube, I wanted to have as many different synergies and different ways to use the small trinket artifacts as possible. And you've done something similar in this cube, I think, where it looks like the sagas trying to use the whole buffalo, you could say, like blinking sagas for value, recurring sagas, manipulating their counters, copying their abilities, ramping with sagas, sacrificing the sagas, like we mentioned, using them as an enchantment. There's so many different things that sagas do that make them much more interesting than just an enchantment might be in general, like we mentioned.
Yeah, I like the comparison you're making between your trinket cube, which I now hope to be able to try one day. It sounds really cool. Obviously, because I've designed this cube that is ostensibly all about moving cardboard around, I will enjoy other cubes that are also about moving lots of cardboard around. And it sounds like your trinket cube would be right up my alley for that aspect, considering I've also had on the back burner a while an Esper cube, which is the ethos of Esper Pixies, but an entire cube. So something that's gameplay that I've really been drawn to. And some of that definitely shows up here. When you mentioned All Will Be One, that's a card I've thought about putting in the cube for a while. It just maybe it's a little too slow for the power level that I've aimed for. I mean, it's always a little rough when you look at a card like All Will Be One and you look at a card like Replenish and you're like, I don't know that these two can exist in the same environment. But yeah, that's a gameplay I've really been drawn towards. I really like that Sagas offer so many different aspects for people to use. There's the counters, there's the card itself, there's the tokens that they make, there's the cards that they draw, there's the resources they give you. Sometimes it's food, sometimes it's creatures, buffs, +1/+1 counters. There's ways to manipulate all those different things in the cube. It creates a lot of possibility space. The problem, as you may have also encountered, particularly in your proliferate cube, as when you try to do this, you create a lot of different items that you ask players to pay attention to, and that can get a little overwhelming. So managing that balance is something I've been very cognizant of. Is at what point does the balance feel just right? Where I'm asking players to consider all these different things about how a saga operates, its card types, its counters, its tokens, etc., that they can use, and at what point does that get overwhelming? And finding that balance has always been really tricky. I don't know that I've even got it right, but it's definitely miles better than where it was in the past. I think it's tough as a designer because, especially you know this because you have designed all of these things, and as you get more familiar with them, the temptation to put a little bit more complexity because it's so interesting, it's so juicy to the designer brain to put it in there, and then to find out that the players end up a little overwhelmed. That's a tension that I am consistently experiencing with this design ethos of trying to get players to use all of the buffalo in some way, as you put it.
Yeah, that's something I wanted to actually ask you more about. Sagas are inherently complex.
Hmm.
You have to pay attention to the first trigger, the second trigger, the third trigger, sometimes more. And each turn, it does something different. And that's a really cool part of the gameplay with sequencing and paying attention. But I definitely, in my proliferate cube, have noticed sometimes the engine can get a little bit overworked. And it
Yeah.
could be like 50 things going on at once. Tell me about the complexity budget that you've given yourself for this cube more.
Hmm. The complexity budget for the Sagas cube, I will admit, I think that there is a version of the cube that you could build where it has a low complexity budget. You're playing multiples. We're talking three, maybe even four copies of just some of the basic sagas. You're talking like three copies of Birth of Meletus, three copies of Flicker of Fate, three copies of Modern Age, three copies of Welcome to Sweet Tooth. These just like basic building block sagas, and you have like maybe a couple splashes. I have chosen not to do that. I've chosen to lean into the complexity budget in a lot of ways. So playing the cube is an inherently complex experience. The complicated board states, I'm trying to make a feature, not a bug. These long, grindy games are something that I think sagas are really well suited to, where you're going to be able to resolve all these abilities in a way where each chapter ability will feel impactful. The shorter the games go, the less impact that the sagas tend to have on the games. So it's hard to produce long, grindy games and also have low complexity budget. You can do it. It's not impossible. I just think that having long, grindy games with a low complexity budget and also have a high density of sagas would be really hard to do. And so I think the cube will be better served by going in a higher complexity direction. There's obviously a limit to that. So some of the limit I've tried to put on the cube itself is that a lot of the non-saga cards have to be pretty grokkable and pretty simple, with one exception, which it's just a pet card. I can't cut it. It's too hard. But with one exception, I remember reading a cube article a while back that said like players don't have problems reading cards. They have problems reading multiple cards in a row. It makes it easier for people to digest a long wordy card if it's surrounded by two ponders, right? So that's a design ethos that I've tried to adopt in my cube as a means to monitor both the gameplay, legibility, and board state complexity perspectives, just giving players more easily digestible effects that they can play alongside these wordy sagas. So that's how I've partially attempted to manage it. One of my favorite examples of cards in the cube that I give for like this is a card like Dominate, which you don't see in a lot of cubes. For those unfamiliar, it is a blue instant for X and in a colorless UU, and you just gain control of target creature with mana cost X. Really simple. You don't see it in a lot of cubes because it's kind of costly and it's a bit expensive, but it reads really clean. People read it, they understand the effect. I can gain control of a creature at instant speed given that I put enough mana into it. And it's kind of up to players to figure out how best to use that. It turns out the answer is that when there are 80 cards in the cube where a decent chunk of them contribute to the board by making tokens, this is, in a lot of cases, just X, one blue, instant steal control of a token, right? And that is a really great way that I've tried to put where it has really low gameplay complexity, But if the players decide to put the extra mental energy to figure out how this card interacts with the rest of the cube, there's a lot more depth there. But it doesn't cause a lot more depth for the average person just reading through the pack. It's enjoyable depth. That's what I really like about it. It has a card that has new context, that has a really simple effect that is heightened by being in this type of environment.
Yeah, I was just reading Dominate as you were talking. I've never seen that card before. It's a that's a
Yeah.
really interesting effect to be in here. And I totally agree with what you were just saying about the complexity budget and leaning into the complexity because I think certain cubes, when people hear the name or the elevator pitch or the description, they kind of go into it expecting a certain amount of complexity. When
Mhm.
people hear the regular cube or a popper cube, their first thought is probably, oh, it's probably a lower complexity, more limited like format.
Yeah.
And that's what they're expecting going into it. But when I hear the Sagas cube, I know in my head already that sagas have a lot going on. And I imagine
Yeah.
people go into the cube expecting to have to put in some brain power into it and ready for a more complex environment. So
Mhm.
I agree with leaning into that rather than maybe subverting people's expectations and making it less complex.
Yeah, I think that was definitely a crossroads that I experienced as I was building this. I actually, the idea first came to mind because I was preparing for Cali Cube Champs and I was looking at what cubes I wanted to play. And I saw Bones's Eiganjo Drift Vehicles Cube. And then not too long after that, probably like a couple minutes, I was like, I could build the Sagas Cube. Initially, I took a lot of design inspiration from his Eiganjo Drift Cube, but I realized that vehicles, I think, are more immediately grokkable than sagas can be. And vehicles are have complexity in their own ways regarding, activation and cost and stuff like that. But sagas have it also physical complexity that they lean into, ticking down every turn. And I realized that my environment probably wasn't going to be as simple as Bones's vehicle cube. And I think it benefited me more to lean into some of that complexity. I mean, that's allowed me to add some of my favorite cards to the cube. I'm asking players to do a lot of digesting. There's a couple mystery booster cards in here. I wouldn't have put them in here if they didn't interact with sagas, but one of them is one of my favorite cards in the cube. It's deceptively strong. It is called The Many Deeds of Belzenlock. Aside from being an absolute flavor home run, it's a saga for 1 and a black, and its chapter 1 is exile target saga from a graveyard, copy its chapter 1 ability. Its chapter 2 ability is exile target saga from a graveyard, copy its chapter 2 ability. And its chapter 3 ability is exile target saga from a graveyard, copy its chapter 3 ability. It's actually a pretty simple card when you read it, but its play space is massive. And how you choose to use this card is insane. I've had people put turn 2 8/8 hexproof Krakens into play in the cube because they've put it in like a reanimator archetype and they're reanimating the chapter 1 of Kiora Best the Sea God, right? I've had people put this in like a value version of the cube where they're like copying the chapter 1 of the Akroan War and like stealing their opponent's creatures. I've had people put this in like there was in a time like a mill archetype, and you could put this in there and copy your opponent's sagas that they've milled, or there's a self mill archetype there. But nobody's seen this card before because it does not play in any other cube. I think if I were trying to lower the complexity budget, like this would be one of the first cards that I would cut because it's a card nobody's seen before. It copies Saga chapter abilities and has some weird rules restrictions with how you do that. And that it's a mystery booster card, so it's already immediately jarring when you look at it in the pack. There's another mystery booster card here too called the Grand Tour. I'm not going to bother reading out for you. Listeners, you can go look that one up for yourself if you're curious, but it's functionally a blink spell, but it's instant speed. It comes immediately into play. Problem is you have to read like through 5 different steps in order to get to read what the actual card does, which is exile a permanent you control and return it to the battlefield immediately. Those cards are cards that I think interact with the cube in an interesting way. The Grand Tour, by the way, is the one exception. The card that I refuse to cut for being too complex because I love how it interacts with the cube. And people, they read it and then they go, why? And then they figure it out. And then that is an enjoyable experience for them that I really like having in the cube. And I saw a lot of positive reactions to it at BCP that has emboldened my decision to keep it in. But if it were a lower complexity level, that's just a card I'd have to cut pretty immediately. There's also cards, sagas, because of how they work, there's some weird rules with removing counters, especially when the chapter 3 ability is on the stack. And if I were building a simpler version of the cube, I probably wouldn't be able to lean into some of those more niche interactions, which do create very interesting gameplay experiences. And I think the cube does lose a lot if you decide to remove those interactions. I think there's a version of the cube that just runs, the couple, as I mentioned before, the best versions of sagas multiple times, but I don't think that that's the version where the cube is at its best. If you have the saga cube, it's because you want to let people explore everything that sagas can be, and that is going to involve a lot of complexity. So I've had to lean into it, and I think the players have enjoyed the experience for having done so.
I mean, I love the many deeds of Belzenlog. This card is perfect for the cube. Where else
Oh
would you
yeah,
play this? It's like it was
you can't
designed for this
like
cube.
it's got to go here. That's it.
I think that's awesome. I'm a huge fan of adding weird conspiracy cards or
Yep,
weird cards from unsets. It's great. And I think more cubes should lean into it. It's so fun.
I agree.
And this cube does include duplicates for certain effects. That's one thing
Mhm.
I wanted to ask you about. Like, for example, there are duplicates of what I was looking at, what I would consider to be a lot of the lower cost sagas, like Kumano Faces Kazan, The
Mhm.
Life of Toshiro Umezawa, and Michiko's Reign of Truth, but also some other effects. For example, having multiple Withering Torments, which makes sense. It's black enchantment removal, and there's not a lot of that in Magic.
Yep.
Tell me about what cards you decided to duplicate and what the reason that you felt you had to make duplicates for it.
Sure. I'll answer your second question first because it will guide how the duplicates I have chosen to put in the cube. I think what was important for me was realizing that when you have a cube that's already this wordy and this complex, having duplicates of effects will help players a lot in packs because they don't have to reread a card once having read it already, seeing it in the cube, right? So that was my first design reason for putting in duplicates. The second design reason was that some cards are cooler than others. And I have always said, a designer, that I would rather play with more cool cards than less cool cards. And playing with two copies of a card is sometimes cooler than playing with one copy of a card and then one less cool copy of the card. I'd rather just play two copies of the cool cards. So, like in cubes where Bones uses the example of having like Searing Spear and Incinerate,
I was about to
just
say that.
just put two Searing Spears in the cube or two Incinerates or whatever one is most makes sense, Though I don't want to have a cube with Shock and Lightning Bolt. I'm just going to run two Lightning Bolts instead or two Shocks, whatever I think the cube is best served for. So that was another reason I did it. And the third reason I did it is because sagas have a pretty narrow range of effects, right? There's only two sagas that cost one mana. There are more that cost two, but still not quite the same amount. So I needed a specific density of some effects and some curve filling cards. So there's two Kumano Faces Kakazans because it's just one of the only sagas that costs one mana. That and no Kiba Reckoner Raid. I thought about going up to three copies of them and just seeing what that does. I've been a little hesitant to do that yet because I do like variance. And in some cases, I think unless the point is to reduce the variance of just how decks play out, I think that I want to have a little bit more of that variance in. So, for example, I think if you could run three copies of Kumano Faces Kakazan in your deck, you would basically be able to build a deck as if you had one of those on turn one every game. And a deck that has one of those on turn one every game looks very different from like a deck that has two Kumano Faces Kakazans and you just play like a red-green aggro deck. I think those things look very different. The first one is not something I've decided is within my design goals right now. I just like the variance of two copies, but not quite three, unless I'm including the third copy specifically to reduce variance. That's not a point I've gotten to yet. I think that the balance of having two copies is just about right. So to just summarize the answer to that question, number one is because effects are unique. Number two is because some cards are cooler than others. And number three is because curve considerations.
That makes a lot of sense. A lot of sagas, like you mentioned, start around 3 mana
Mhm.
because it's hard to design a 1 or 2 mana saga because they get a lot of value inherently. And at
Yes,
1 or 2 mana, it's like designing a 1 or 2 mana planeswalker. You have to be pretty careful.
you do. So that's, yeah, exactly it. Nailed it on the head.
Definitely. And one thing that's really cool that you sent me was, as we mentioned, this cube was at Boston Cube Party, and you did a really awesome analysis of the drafts from that event that I really wanted to talk to you about, get
Yeah,
into
of
the
course.
stats of the cube. Like, one thing that was really interesting to me that you mentioned was the match percentage win rates by color. And I was pretty
Yeah.
surprised. Like, I would not have expected looking at this cube or having it described to me, to have red be the highest win rate color in a enchantment focused cube. Like I would have expected that to be green or white because, as we mentioned, those are the enchantress colors. Why do you feel that red was so powerful?
Yeah, there's a couple reasons. Number one is because I definitely tuned its power up a little too much just before the event. I learned something really important for this event. It does answer your question a little bit as to the power level of red at the event. I was worried about how many games were going to go to time. And I was worried about people building too many decks that were going to accrue value and on an end, but have no functional way to win the game. And I thought that by putting functional, like really strong aggressive decks into the cube, it would encourage people to play a bit more proactively. That's not what ended up happening. I should know better. You should not fight player behavior in design of your cube. And if players want to dirtle, they're gonna dirtle. And
That's what
I
I would do
gave
in
them
this
all the
cube. I
tools to
dirtle
dirtle as
all over the
well.
place.
Yeah, dirtling is really fun. When you send to the Saga's cube, players expect that they're going to be able to dirtle a little bit. And there's a lot of that in the cube. I also enabled that by some of the design card choices in the cube, right? I've enabled an environment where I've let people dirtle for a while. And then I've also created an environment where by setting up a prevent, I have put limits onto how much dirtling there can be. And so while this design iteration of the cube works really well for untimed drafts, the fact that these had a timer and that I was pressured to try to get games concluding within a certain range meant I made some design changes just before the event. That included removing all of the enters the battlefield tapped lands from the cube and replacing them with untapped lands specifically that deal people damage in the form of shock lands and pain lands. So you will see that there are 2 copies of each pain land and 2 copies of each shock land within the cube that are designed at forcing people to be a little more cognizant of their own life total in a way that they might not have been with just a bunch of tap lands. Second thing I did was I bumped up the power level of aggro a little bit, including the controversial decision to add 2 Heartfire Hero into the cube. So that specifically was a problem for players because Heartfire Hero has a bit of a reputation that it is earned very reasonably from Pioneer and Standard. And the last kind of tweak that I made right before the event as well, so I had a special rule right before the event where each player would get 3 Valgavost Layers. Valgavost Layer is an enchantment land that enters the battlefield tapped, and when it enters the battlefield, you choose a color. You taps for that color. So it's an enchantment land with hexproof, so it synchronizes with a bunch of things in the cube. It was really cool and interesting, but I also removed that from the event, partially due to time reasons. Like actually playing a Valgavost Layer requires a bunch of time. Explaining that each player gets 3 of them has a bunch of time. Players spend more time deck building because they have 3 free lands now, so they end up being able to have like a larger pool of consideration. So deck building took more time. So a lot of those things I cut. So you had an environment where players were taking more damage from their lands, players were incentivized to dirtle, they were given the tools to dirtle, and yet there were at least 1 or 2 really strong aggressive decks that were capable of knocking your teeth in. The last point I want to make, which was not related to, it is related to why red was strong, but it's not related to the changes I made just before the event, is that red already has some of the best sagas in the cube, right? If you're looking like Fable the Mirror Breaker, which should need no explanation to people that are exposed to tournament and competitive Magic. You have the Akroan War, which is a Pioneer All-Star, was good in Standard. The fact that it just steals a creature. Because you can remove counters from sagas, some sagas become way, way better in an environment like this, where that type of thing is encouraged. So the Akroan War is one of them. You have Origin of the Hidden Ones, which I'm not going to read out all its effects, but it's basically a Flametongue Kavu that can go face, right? So you have this 4-mana card that produces creatures and deals 4 damage to anything. And remember, you can remove counters from it to get effects. So you can continually deal your opponent damage after turn after turn after turn. There's also another saga called the Flux, which when it enters the battlefield,
I love
deals
this
4
card.
damage.
This card's
Yeah,
so good.
it deals 4 damage to something, and at the beginning of your draw phase, whenever you add a lore counter on it, you exile the top card of your library and you can play it. So red has some of the best sagas in the entire cube. You had some of the best creatures in Heartfire Hero. Sagas already want you to target creatures as a way that they contribute to the board. So you had players taking damage from their lands. You had strong aggressive deck. You had power outlier cards in both sagas and creatures. And then you had everyone else doing really slow, dirtily things. So that is how we ended up at the spot where red had the highest win percentage of any color among decks at the weekend. Decks with red won about 56% of the time. Decks with green won about 51% of the time. And the other 3 colors were between 44 and 45% of the time. That doesn't sound like a lot, but it is a 10 percentage point difference and among 4 drafts. That's not technically statistically significant. So backed up with player testimony that really backed up a lot of the things I was explaining, that is how we ended up with where we're at. It was interesting for me to see how the event played out, to get data on this feedback. There were 2 cards people complained about the whole weekend. One was Heartfire Hero. The other was Flux Channeler for being too weak. That's not really that important. But Heartfire Hero was the one where people were like, this card was really strong. I didn't have a good way to answer it, and it killed me really quickly. It did not feel like the bursty damage was part of the cube ethos. I did think about how people were going to answer Heartfire Hero. The problem is, 1-drops are hard to answer with 2 mana value plus spells. It does not matter if the spell cleanly takes care of the Heartfire Hero. It is still a strong tempo advantage for the Heartfire Hero player to have their Heartfire Hero answered by an effect that costs more than 1 mana. And that is something that I forgot, I guess, somehow to consider when designing this. So the way I tried to answer this was the cube already has a lot of bounce because sagas contribute to the board in 3 primary ways, right? They make tokens, they get you card advantage in some way that's sometimes killing creatures or drawing cards, or they buff creatures you already have. So I thought Heartfire here would be interesting as a creature that would come down in turn 1 that you could buff with a turn 2 saga. Unfortunately, I forgot to realize that Heartfire Hero is a 1-drop that can grow bigger and bigger and bigger. Does not also need you to play sagas in order for it to get bigger. You can just put like an equipment and your Heartfire Heroes become amazing. And I kind of forgot that in a way that the other 1-drops in the cube don't really have that. So that's how you know that this was kind of a change made just before an event, is because there was not the amount of testing time that went into vetting whether that this was going to be right for the cube or not. And now I can say with hindsight from the event, this is not a change that I want with the cube. I want the slower, grindier decks to be a bit more on par in terms of win rate with a lot of these red decks. And it's not to say that the grindier, slower decks did not do their fair share of winning over the course of the weekend. The other problem was that red was pretty linear. It did not have a lot of archetype bleed with the rest of the cube. So I've been looking into ways in which I can kind of expand red's ability to play in more mid-rangey or even control-y shells, rather than just being a more aggressive color. Not to say that people didn't splash red. If red was one of the main colors of your deck, you won a lot at Boston Cube Party.
I mean, Heartfire Hero is a ridiculous card. There's so many sagas that can target, and even if you can remove it, you get to deal a lot of damage to the opponent's face. So it feels bad even removing it.
Yeah. Again, the ways I had attempted to try to answer it, where black had a lot of -X effects, which is really good at killing Heartfire Hero because you no longer take damage from it having power. Bounce is a great way of answering Heartfire Hero because it resets all of the progress you've made on it. And usually Heartfire Hero requires a bit of investment. Exile removal is really good against Heartfire Hero, and that's something that white is really good at. So black has a lot of the -X. White has a lot of exile. Blue has a lot of bounce. And red has a lot of deal damage, then exile something. And I was like, surely that these answers will prevent Heartfire Hero from killing people. It was not necessarily then the Heartfire Heroes was the tempo advantage gained from having a 1-drop that was answered by a 2 or 3 mana spell. That was winning games for the Heartfire Hero players. That was something that I really appreciated. Steven, who's Zoidraft, who helped me put the data together, because I'm not a data guy. I'm a historian. Numbers are not my thing. I need them presented in front of me in order to be able to begin to interpret them. And player testimony was also really big in helping me figure that out too.
I think it's so cool what you also mentioned about the lands, that you put in shock lands and pain lands to try and increase aggro's efficacy.
Yes.
Because I feel like that's something that people don't really think about with cube design in general very often is, hey, if I want red aggro to be really good, I'm going to put in really good red aggro cards. But other more creative ways that you can make red better, like making lands deal a lot of damage to yourself, so the red aggro deck doesn't have to put in as much effort. So it's just simpler and easier for the aggro deck to kill you. That's a really cool way to do it.
Yeah, that's a design lesson you get from Modern, right? I mean, Modern Burned, historically, they've always said you don't need to deal 20 damage. You need to deal 17 damage. So in a similar cube, what if aggro doesn't need to go the full distance and deal 20 damage? What if they need to deal 15, 16 damage, right? Against most decks. So that was something I was considering as well. So the problem with the tap lands is that they generally create slower games because people were resolving more powerful spells, usually on average, half a turn to a turn later. I'm approximating there, but that sounds right in my head, so we're going to run with it. They're resolving more impactful spells later, so it does draw out the game a bit. And if you have lands that come to play untapped and people are taking damage, games will resolve quicker, but it still gives people the chance to cast their spells. And I think the reason cube designers don't already consider that is because most cubes already start with some amount of fetch, shock type mana base, where damage is part of the expected experience of playing lands. I had an experience where it was built around players not taking damage from their lands. So I wanted to experience what it was like when players are taking damage from their lands and what that does to the speed of games.
Yeah, absolutely. And Joe, let's jump into a pack one, pick one here. I'll read it
Okay.
off. We got a pack with Monumental Henge, which is a white land that enters tapped unless you control planes. And you can look at the top 5 cards of your library and reveal a historic card and put it in your hand by paying 2 white, white. So that's really powerful because sagas are historic.
Mhm.
We have Calyx, Guided by Fate, which is 1 green, white for a 2/2. This card I have in my Bant cube, and I think it's really cool.
Yep.
It has Constellation, so whenever it or another enchantment enters, put a 1/1 counter on target creature. And whenever Calyx or an enchanted creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you can create a token that's a copy of a non-legendary enchantment you control. So that card's
Yeah, it's a
really
wordy one.
powerful.
Yep.
Then we have the Mending of Dominaria, 3 green, green. The first 2 abilities, put the top 2 of your library in your grave. You can return a creature from your grave to your hand. Then in the third, you can return all lands from the grave to the battlefield. We have the Ballad of the Black Flag, which is a Assassin's Creed saga.
Mhm.
The first 3 abilities, mill 3, and then you can put a historic card in your hand from your grave. The fourth is your historic spells cost 2 less this turn. The Inventive Iteration, 3 and a blue. First ability, return up to 1 target creature or planeswalker to its owner's hand. Second, return an artifact from your graveyard to your hand. And if you can't draw a card. And then the third one, exile it and then return to the battlefield transformed. And then we have the Hungry Hungry Heifer. This card is
Yeah.
awesome.
Let's
It's
go.
2 and a green for Moo. It's a 3/3. During your upkeep, remove a counter from any card you control or sacrifice Hungry Hungry Heifer. This card is awesome and it's perfect for this cube. Being able to remove counters is really powerful with sagas.
Yep.
Then we have Stomping Ground, Red Green Shock, the Modern Age. So it's a 1 and a blue for a saga that you, for the first 2 abilities, draw a card, then discard a card. And then on the third ability, it exiles and returns itself to the battlefield transformed as a creature.
Mhm.
Then we have Welcome to Sweet Tooth for a 1 and a green, create a 1/1. Second ability, create a food. On the third ability, put X 1/1 counters on target creature control, where X is 1 plus the number of foods you control.
Mhm.
Temple Garden, green, white shock. Beseech the Mirror, which has bargain and can tutor for a card. And if it has mana value 4 or less, if you bargained, you can cast it. Carplucent Forest, red, green shock. Ghostly Dancers, 3 white, white for a 2/5 flyer. When it enters, returning an enchantment from your graveyard to your hand. It has unlock a door stuff too, but that doesn't matter here. And then whenever enchantment control enters, you get a 1/1. Experiment Augury, 1 blue for an instant anticipate that also lets you proliferate. And then Throw Parasite, black for a 1/1 with extort that you can pay 2 life and tap it to remove a counter from target non-land permanent. Woo, wow. That was definitely the wordiest pack I've ever done a
Oh
pack
yeah.
pick one for with all these sagas. Man, I
I wouldn't be
need a
surprised if
break.
my cube was one of the wordiest cubes on Cube Cobra. And I'm too afraid to do the analysis, so nobody do that, okay, please?
Yeah, I need a rest after that. So
Yeah.
what do you think of this pack?
Do you mind if you go first and do what you think of the pack first before I give my thoughts?
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, there are a bunch of sagas in here that are powerful, like the Ballad of the Black Flag, giving value, the Inventive Iteration, bouncing something, the Modern Age just being a cheap saga that loots. And then Ghostly Dancers is also a really cool payoff that it gets you an enchantment back, but then you also create guys. But I'm just so interested in the cards that remove counters, like Hungry Hungry Heifer and Throw Parasite. Those just look like so fun to play in this cube. And I feel like other people would have a similar thought when they see them. I think I'm probably taking Hungry Hungry Heifer. I don't know if that's right, but it just seems so fun to get that extra value from your sagas.
Mhm.
Like if you play Welcome to Sweet Tooth and then Hungry Hungry Hyper, and you could just keep getting food or 1/1s,
Yep.
that seems so sweet.
It is very sweet. Hungry Hungry Heifer, in terms of like a range of upside to downside, right? Its upside is immense. It's really easy to see how good it could be. It is also really to see how bad it could be because a single disenchant and all of a sudden you also lose your 3/3. So it requires a lot of setup in order to make a scenario where you can confidently resolve a Hungry Hungry Heifer. Because if you don't have any counters on any permanents, you do have to sacrifice it. Throw Parasite has a downside on the other side, where 2 life, it's not an insignificant cost to its ability, which is tap, remove counters from a permanent. Your eyes being drawn to those 2 types of effects is good because there are going to be less cards that remove counters in the cube than there are going to be powerful sagas. So in this one, you should take the enabler first rather than the sagas here. So I think keying in on Hungry Hungry Heifer, Throw Parasite is definitely good to do. There's a couple ways that my brain is attempting to think about this pack. The first is that in terms of like just utility, the Modern Age is an incredibly powerful card. For those of you that have played the cube before, Reanimator is actually something that you can do to a degree in the cube. Playing turn 2 the Modern Age and then playing turn 4 Replenish is a very powerful and very linear strategy. You can discard stuff like Kiorbest Sea God and play Abuela's Awakening, the card in Standard that puts an enchantment onto the battlefield and makes a spirit. Well, you can do that with Kiorbest Sea God. Modern Age not only is it just a very good card on its own, but it enables some very powerful things to happen in the cube. Ghostly Dancers, unsurprisingly, if you have an environment where you have a lot of enchantments that are very good at sending themselves to the graveyard, a card that can recur enchantments and give you bonus whenever you play one is going to be really powerful. So Ghostly Dancer is an extremely powerful mid-range card that my eye is also drawn to. The last one, which I think might actually be my pack one pick one, so out of the groups of the Enabler, the Ghostly Dancers, and the top end payoff, is actually Inventive Iteration for a number of reasons. Number one, its effects are super powerful. Return a creature is really good in this queue because there's a lot of tokens running around. So the flexibility is sometimes you have your Inventive Iteration turns into a Flame Tongue Kabu when people decide to go all in on a token. I mean, even if you just look at this pack, right? Resetting the Modern Age. Welcome to Sweet Tooth makes a token. Bouncing Hungry Hungry Heifer, Throw Parasite are going to be good. Ghostly Dancers make tokens. Bouncing a Calyx, which buffs itself. Like, Inventive Iteration lines up really well against a lot of things that are happening in this pack. Its Chapter 2 oftentimes means draw a card, but can sometimes mean more than that if you have some of a couple artifact synergies in the cube. And then it flips into a very strong tempo card. So it's going to fit into a lot of different archetypes, has a lot of very powerful abilities. They're going to be pretty easy to build around. That might be my pick here for pack one, pick one. So that's how I'm attempting to resolve it. I think if you didn't go with Inventive Iteration, you probably want to go Thrall Parasite, because the trick that Thrall Parasite lets you do that Hungry Hungry Heifer that does not let you do, and this gets into the complexity of the cube, is if you remove a counter from a saga while its Chapter 3 ability is on the stack, it will not be sacrificed when its Chapter 3 ability resolves. So you have a bit more flexibility to how you use and abuse Throw Parasite versus Hungry Hungry Heifer. And I think that is worth the cost of paying 2 life to use it.
It also has Extort.
It does have Extort. I've never seen anyone actually extort something.
Oh,
I'm sure it's come up, just like does not happen very often.
yeah. So you're on Throw Parasite.
I think I might be on Throw Parasite or Inventive Iteration.
Yeah, the Inventive Iteration is really interesting. Like you mentioned, being able to return the sagas that flip back to your hand to be able to get the value from them again. And the Inventive Iteration, reading the backside, 3/3 flyer. Whenever you cast a spell, your opponents can't cast spells the same mana value as that spell until your next turn. I mean, that's really strong when so many cards in this cube are enchantments. You have to play at sorcery speed.
Yep,
That's
precisely.
That
Really
card
good.
is really good. That might actually be one of my first picks.
It really well into like a Bant tempo deck. Someone this weekend had the cube of Calyx into Inventive Iteration
Ooh,
and was just brutal. So they played Inventive Iteration, bounced their thing, put a +1/+1 counter, Calyx, swung in, copied their Inventive Iteration, bounced their another opponent's thing. And eventually it's just like, that's so hard to come back from. And Inventive Iteration pairs with a lot of just really good things in the cube. I think that would be my pick here.
yeah, very cool. And thanks for coming on the show, Joe. It's been awesome having you on. Anything else you want to say before we wrap up here?
No, it was awesome to meet you, Ian. This is a really cool podcast. I'm glad you put me onto it as well, and I will be following it in future installments with a great degree of closeness. If this is something you ever thought about doing, you can follow the Cube on Cube Cobra. Feel free to copy, make your own version. I love seeing that there's a couple different versions of the Cube out there now, and people are getting back to me with their own responses on what they think belongs and what doesn't, and I think that's really cool. Wizards, if you're listening to this, Can you please print a saga that has flash and its chapter one ability is counter target spell? That's something the queue desperately needs. Can you please print that?
That
That's all I
that would be
have.
great.
Yeah, it would be.
Very awesome. And I hope to see everyone next week. Thank you all for listening. Please like, subscribe, follow, all that fun stuff. And thanks again, Joe, for coming on. And have a great night, everyone.